Welcome to Rational Discourse Weekly. It's Monday, March 25th, 2013. I'm William Garrison.
And I'm Michael Aune.
And this week we talk a little bit about Jesus and the Easter tradition.
And our thoughts on the sort of overarching story of Easter and why it's a little bit too much for us to swallow.
So stay tuned. All right, so Easter Sunday is coming up, and so we wanted to talk a little bit about the death and resurrection of Jesus, which I'm assuming is what Easter is really about. I talked to you a little bit before the show, but even being raised as a Christian, I'm sure in church, like, stories were told to me, but I was never told this is why we're celebrating with Easter eggs and bunnies and the scavenger hunt and dressed in pastel colors.
That is really, I believe, more pagan attachments that have gotten various spring rites that have gotten attached to Easter, which in theory has been argued by some is actually a kind of, it's the rebirth, just like it's happening in spring when you have the rebirth after winter. It's supposed to be potentially metaphorical. But in any case, obviously most Christians, I should say all Christians probably, don't hold that to be true. They hold it to be the literal truth, because otherwise Christianity sort of falls apart. That's why Easter is important. Because the idea of Easter is that there was a blood debt that had to be paid in terms of sin, and Jesus was the blood sacrifice by which that debt was paid to God. And so that is why the crucifixion is so important, and that's why Easter is ultimately so important, because his death paid the blood debt, and his resurrection, basically proved his promise that he was God, or the Son of God, and that the blood debt had been paid. And that's why it is only through Jesus that you are absolved of your sins.
Right.
Because unless you acknowledge, basically, that the blood debt has been paid, I guess you're considered still indebted to God, who is Jesus, to whom he sacrificed himself. It's very confusing.
It's like God is the only human that is essentially the one that can save us from sin.
Well, I think this touches on the interesting concept of that, in a sense, what Christians are actually asking us to buy is an incredibly contrived story. And that if you hash it out in more generic terms, or you don't label it as Christian or Jesus or Easter or the crucifixion, it really is kind of ridiculous sounding. Yeah. The idea that God creates a creature that he knows is imperfect, but drives that creature into an indebted position, which is morally, to God. This creates a situation where for mankind to be redeemed according to the rules that God set up, God has to have a blood sacrifice that is worthy of the debt. So he impregnates a woman with himself to give birth to him.
Which I want to quickly interject. Why couldn't he just be a teenager already or something? I don't understand the significance of the birth, is what I'm saying. And this is one weird thing about Catholics versus
Protestants. It's only because he was
Protestants.
born, I think, is the thing. The fact that he was born as a human. And he didn't just appear as a demigod on Earth. He was... It's important in many ways that he is reflective of humanity. That he is... Like the Catholic Church holds that he is both human and divine at the same time. He is not one before the other.
Well, I brought up the Catholic Church because they seem to place more importance on Mary than Protestants. Protestants seem to give two shits about Mary. They don't.
Well, I read before in a book called, it was The Jesus Mysteries, and then, for the life of me, I cannot think of the name of the follow-up book. But it was basically the idea that Christianity was actually metaphorical. It was a Gnostic Christian sect, which was a way to incorporate various Middle Eastern Gnostic traditions, which were mystical in tone, through a Jewish lens. You could interpret them through the Jewish lens. So the Jews had a history of a historical narrative That's how the Old Testament is written.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be a chronicle, basically. But they had then this mystical, kind of timeless belief system that they were attracted to from other Middle Eastern cultures, whether it was Greek with the Osiris-Dionysus mythology, or you had Mithras from Persia, I believe. And so what they did, it is argued, or has been argued before, is that they basically interpreted that through the Jewish tradition, which was to write this mystical idea through a historical narrative. And then the idea is that then that became confused by people who didn't know it was supposed to be metaphorical as literal truth, because it was written as history, just like all the Jewish texts had been. And so there's this very interesting interplay of sort of like religious politics and branding that potentially went awry, and now we end up with this Christian story. But going back to why that's important, the idea is that in most of the Gnostic religious traditions, there was a divine feminine aspect that was present, and effectively Judaism was lacking that, and a lot of the traditional like tribal religions were lacking a feminine side once they went to monotheism. And Mary was in many ways, it's been argued, smuggled in as a way to bring the divine feminine back in.
Right.
Because her role is effectively passive. She was impregnated, gave birth to Jesus, and after that she really doesn't matter. She has no major functional role.
It's not like she traveled with Jesus or did anything.
But she was the vessel
importance
by which God came into this world. And so, of course, that's given a lot of significance.
Right.
Her role as the suffering mother, the sacrificing mother. But then, of course, Catholics go even farther, and they argue that, actually it's a matter of doctrine now, that she remained a virgin, and then was the Assumption of Mary is where she actually ascended to heaven in bodily form. And now basically reigns there in a sense as like the queen of heaven. And of course she's extremely close to God and Jesus because of her position as the mother of God. And given that Catholics believe basically in a hierarchy, like the reason you pray to saints is because saints are closer to God.
Right.
So they're the conduit by which your prayers can be heard, because they'll basically put in a good word for you. And Mary is like the ultimate feminine. No one gets closer to God than the one who gave birth to him. But then that goes back to, she ends up with her own issues with original sin and the reason that she had to be born. Like, the Immaculate Conception has nothing to do with Jesus. It has to do with the fact that Mary was immaculately conceived without original sin, so that way she did not impart original sin to Jesus, since all humans were supposed to be born with original sin, which was the blood that was being paid by Jesus' very birth, which would have seemed a little weird. Like, I say that sounds a little weird as if the rest of this doesn't sound a little weird. But I think that... So here's the thing. It's a very interesting mythology. It's not a unique mythology. It's not a unique story. It's been around for hundreds of years before it basically appeared in Jewish culture as the Jesus myth. Or mythos, I should say. And, I mean... It's one of those things, when you start talking about it in these more just straightforward terms, you pull away the descriptive language, you pull away the beauty of the sacrifice, and when you actually lay it out, it's kind of like a bullet point storyline.
Even just in modern words, and that, I think that goes past the Easter story or the resurrection. It's like I can almost point at anything in the Bible, like the story of creation.
Yeah.
Or Noah's Ark or any of this stuff. And if you just explain it in simple terms, I think a 5-year-old, if you explain it in simple terms, would have questions.
Versus these are fundamental questions, too. They're not like, where did Noah get the animals? Well, I mean, you could have some convoluted thing, but like...
Where did all the insects fit? Were dinosaurs there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How big's a cubit? Because apparently, if it's the size we think it is, then
it's
nowhere even close. Of course, if your kid knows what a cubit is,
I think
you should high five him.
I remember reading an article once, and this is what the internet is great for. But they were doing size comparisons between Noah's Ark allegedly and like the Titanic or something.
Yeah, Titanic like dwarfs it by like 5 times or something retarded. I mean, it was realistically, I mean, it was a large wooden boat for its time.
Yeah.
There were probably Roman like frigates that were as big, if not bigger, in terms of actual space.
Yeah. It seems like whoever needed to embellish the story of Noah's Ark didn't embellish it enough. Like, you know what? 100 cubits.
What?
Mind blowing. Damn, I should have not.
To be fair,
I don't know how many cubits.
He was probably the only guy in the village who could count to 100.
Right.
I mean, we're talking. This is a time period before I think 0 was a conceived concept. So I mean, they were working with what they had. But this time of year always strikes me as interesting because obviously it's one of the most important. It's one of the. I mean, it's Holy Week. You know, this is the period during which, you know, supposedly 2,000. Well, not quite 1,980 years ago, Jesus was betrayed, led to the cross, sacrificed, resurrected. And this is the central story for Christianity, which I think it's easy in some ways to get that message lost because Christmas dominates the year more. You've got 6 weeks, 2 months of Christmas. But like the birth of Jesus is effectively meaningless. It really has no functional value other than to show that he was of human descendant, basically.
Well, because we've talked about this before. Even if a person named Jesus existed, and I have no way of proving or disproving,
seems to me a big if. But
even if he existed, even if he was born on December 25th, that literally does nothing in the way of proving Christianity's authenticity.
Well, the divinity is completely different.
But the story of the resurrection, like that's a completely different argument. Like,
well, the resurrection is, I mean, that is literally the cornerstone of Christianity.
Right.
That 3-day cycle of resurrection, or death and then resurrection, is
also
literally
side
how
note. I guess he couldn't fly before, but then after he died and was resurrected, he ascended to heaven, so he gained the power of flying.
I mean. It's actually the interesting question. Okay, so heaven is usually interpreted as being literally above, or, people literally go into the sky in the Bible. I think it was Ezekiel was the chariot, ascended directly into heaven. And it's always up. And so, I mean, first of all, it's interesting because he's either in the stratosphere or space, so... Or at some point, like, he floats away and then just, like, disappears from this dimension, in which case I wonder, why didn't you just disappear? But that's neither here nor there. It's probably metaphor or just dramatic imagery, which is fine. But again, we're talking about... This is literally the crux of this entire religion.
Yeah.
And it is, if you describe it in... just normal, non-religious terms, ridiculous. It is... There's no way to cash it out in a way that makes any sort of sense. Like, it just sounds like what a schizophrenic would come up with. The idea that there's a debt that's owed to someone who created the debt because of the rules he put in place, knowing that the debt would be created, then creates a random sacrificial mechanism by which it has to be satisfied, and only he can satisfy it. It's just like this convoluted sort of...
Really poor planning.
Basically...
you and I have talked about this before. I think it's
the Bible did not have a lot of forethought, is what it feels like, in some ways.
If God is all-knowing and all-powerful and all that sort of thing, and like you and I have discussed before, if he is a temporal being and he transcends time and space, then he would have the forethought because he doesn't have to see how things play out.
Yeah.
He would literally just know how they would play out.
Well, it's the idea that God knows only in the present tense. So if you go with an atemporal God who's literally removed from time and space, maybe he creates the Big Bang. Like the universe stems from him, but then God's outside of it. So time is contained within the universe. It is part of the structure. And God sits next to it. Right? Okay. So he gave birth to it in a sense.
But then is hands off after that? Is that...
Well, the idea is that if he's atemporal, meaning he's outside of time.
Okay.
The reason that this is brought up, and this is a complete aside, but it's really interesting. I know Boethius within Christianity, I think, was the first one to argue for this position, and the reason was the problem of foreknowledge. So you get people like St. Augustine, who argued that humans had free will, and because of the execution of that free will, that's why bad things happen in the world to people. And okay, free will is great, but it doesn't work if God already knows everything you're going to do, because then it seems like you don't really have free will. You're just going along with the plan that was in place well before you were born. What choice do you really have? So the atemporal version of God, who's outside of time and doesn't know before or after, because they're meaningless terms outside of a time scale. The idea is that like God's knowledge lines up 1-to-1 with each moment, and he only knows each moment in the present tense. So yes, he knows everything at once, but only in the present tense. So we are podcasting. He knows that we are podcasting, but he doesn't know what will happen or what has happened in the past or future tense. And so that gets around the idea that God has foreknowledge, because God doesn't ever know before something. God simply knows at the moment. Now, he knows all moments simultaneously, but since they're not structured in a past to future structure, you can never say that he knows beforehand what you're going to do. He simply knows as you're doing it what you are doing, which supposedly gets around it. But the problem
or
is...
his master plan.
But now the problem is you've removed him from time. And so how can then God interject with miracles? How can God become Jesus in time?
That's almost that's the argument of a God who... of a personal God versus
That's exactly what it is.
A removed God that just created things and doesn't...
Yeah.
Has no...
It's the... has
no care about what we do.
Deism.
Yeah.
The idea that... Or deism. What did it say either way?
That the universe... and it's like the universe being
it's
a
like
God
it's like God sets the mechanism in motion
Yeah.
and then backs away and just let the mechanism... It's like a clock just going about its various machinations. But he doesn't at one point like step in and like retweak a spring. He goes, no, it is the way it is and it's going to stay there. And that's actually interesting then, because atemporalism generally has to remove God from time and space, which means that God can't interject into time and space, because then he would be temporal. He would have a temporal... God did this at this time would definitively bring God into time and space. So the idea of a personal God who loves you actively, who does small miracles for you, who watches over you, is sort of dependent on him being temporal or having some notion of past and future and time.
Well, and I think that type of God is more common, at least in the human mind.
Oh, for sure. I mean, Christianity is based on the idea.
Your loved one's dying. You're trying to pray hard enough that God will hear you to save your loved one.
Like for Catholicism, I shouldn't say more than. The reason Catholicism is easy in some ways to point out is that Catholicism has strict rules about it. Like, Catholicism, for all of its, in my opinion, wrongness, at least has a structure to its logic. Now, I think their fundamental premises are wrong. So there might be a valid system where, if all of these things were true, this would be the conclusion. But of course, I disagree that all the premises are true. But Catholics, at least, are fairly consistent in their application of when this happens, it's because of, and they list a bunch of reasons that are based on scripture or tradition and logic. And so, like, the whole reason about going back to the Immaculate Conception of Mary was the problem of original sin. So they knew there was a problem. They go, wait a minute, if Jesus was born of a woman with original sin, he's supposed to have original sin. So she can't have original sin. So it was almost like logically necessary, based on their beliefs, that she had to not have original sin so he could be sinless. Which, of course, just makes me ask, you just backed it up one step. You haven't actually solved the problem, you just pushed it back. Because why is she sinless? Which makes no sense.
Because she's the mother of God.
But then why couldn't Jesus just be sinless?
Right.
Like, in any case, I think that was more political in that Mary had already been a fundamental figure within Christianity, at least Catholicism at that point.
Yeah, if this was my religion, I would have made Jesus I wouldn't have made him human. I would have made him like a Superman figure. He came in to save the day, but he's obviously not human. Yeah. I mean, even in the stories, he basically presented himself as non-human, walking on water. He was a magician. He was Chris Angel in those
But
days.
was he more or less emo than Chris Angel? That is the
Yeah.
important question. I'm sure there's a denomination that believes he was more.
I think he was
emo.
less. He didn't cut himself. He let others abuse him.
He
instead.
did let himself get nailed to a tree.
Yeah.
I mean, in all fairness, that's pretty damn emo. But
Yeah.
I don't know. What I find, we should probably stop soon because this could go on for a long, long time. What I find interesting, there are certain things about the biblical story going all the way through the New Testament that are funny because they're necessary but deemed somehow special. So the idea is that, going back to Genesis, like Adam and Eve eat of the tree of knowledge. It's not named that specifically, but that seems to be the general belief about it. And that is how they know of good and evil. Yet without a knowledge of good and evil, how can you live a moral life? Like if you did, it would only be accidentally. So maybe you never murder, maybe you never steal, maybe you live, like you never do anything wrong, but you never know you're not doing anything wrong.
Especially if they truly did have free will. If they were living, like if they were predestined to do these things, then you don't have to answer the question of good and evil because God would direct their every single move. And
well, that's the idea is
So
that they
yeah,
were
it's
effectively robots. And so the only idea that you could have a meaningful relationship to God, where you come to God, is to have a choice. And
Right.
so they're punished for doing the very thing that allows them to have a meaningful relationship with their creator. And then sort of similarly on the back end, like you've got this weird sort of original sin or origination story, which is necessary to even have a meaningful relationship with God. And then God sets the terms such on the back end that he creates a debt you can't repay, then sacrifices himself to repay the debt, thus indebting you forever to him. That's why you can only come to the Father through the Son. You have to go through Jesus. So it's this like convoluted logic where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because you're never really given a choice.
Right.
And it's a false choice, in my opinion, if it's, hey, eternal damnation or heavenly bliss. Well, first of all, without going into the problem of choosing to believe something, I can act as if I believe something. Belief is a passive thing. You either do or you don't. You're now going to hold me hostage effectively to this ridiculous system that you created, that this is your rule book. I'm just the guy that's like forced to play by it.
Right.
And that's to me why this time of year I always sit back and I just think, wow, like on its face, if you actually boil this down, get rid of the imagery and of the weeping Jesus and why have you forsaken me and all of this, get rid of the emotive content. Because I get it, it's an emotional story, and I get why people are moved by it. But when you remove the emotion from it,
I'm moved by Pokemon, so that doesn't impress me.
well, you do have to catch them all.
Yeah.
But that's why when you actually look at what people are asking you to believe,
Yeah.
when you actually really get down and go, let's not mince words here. We're actually talking about blood sacrifice and indebtedness and sin. It sounds absurd. And I think
It sounds crazy, and as an atheist, just the Bible as a whole, just it doesn't empower human thought
it's
and
all
emotion
about
and
being
stuff.
enslaved. You're enslaved to God's will at the end of the day. You're at his whim and his mercy, and you're supposed to feel grateful for when he doesn't damn you in this world or the next. And it makes me happy to not feel beholden to that belief system, and it makes me feel sad in a sense that people still feel that they are, because I think a lot of people are tormented by it. I mean, there are many who receive spiritual nourishment from it. I'm not talking about them. Though I think if we had this conversation in these terms, which I've had with others before, it's a difficult conversation for them to have because they really can't justify it. And it usually comes down to an appeal to emotion or feeling. Well, no, but it feels good.
Like the right thing. Or,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Truthiness, basically, to steal Stephen Colbert's fantastic word. And, to me, the truthiness just doesn't fly. It's not good enough. And, in light of Holy Week, stop asking, because it ain't gonna happen. Even if I wanted to, that's too much to swallow. And I think that if you really sit down and anyone in this world asks you to believe anything similar, you'd tell them to step off, just like I'm going to ask you. So that's Easter for me. Keep your ridiculous traditions to yourself.
And off public grounds.
And off public grounds, yes. And out of my tax system, if we could do that too. But in any case, I think that's a good stopping point. I guess we'll see you all post-Easter. We'll, I'm sure, find something interesting to talk about between now and then. And, check out the website. We've got a couple new articles. William finally has his blurb up about his sort of lifelong transition towards atheism. And I've got a recent article up about the problem of religious moderates and why I think that they are... I think we as skeptics and atheists, not that those two have to go hand in hand, but they seem to, are being disingenuous when we don't press religious moderates on their inconsistencies and their beliefs. And I've got a new article coming up, which should be out. Actually, it probably already is out. Yes, it'll be out this Friday.
Okay.
Friday before this. Friday before Easter. This will be after Easter. Anyway, that'll be on the problem of absolute truth, which should be interesting. I had a lot of fun writing it. So, let us know what you think, and check back and subscribe and email us. I don't know. Something.
Thanks.
See you next week. Right.